Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar titled Becoming a Sustainable Business. Just a few general housekeeping rules before I start. All attendees' microphones are muted. If you've got any questions, please feel free to ask those in the chat, but we will follow those up after the webinar. We do tend to get quite a lot, so we like to follow these things up individually afterwards. Also, if you've got any comments for our guest speaker, please feel free to send those through to us, and we'll make sure that they go through to the right person as well. If you'd like to know more about what MBS do after the webinar, you can visit thembs.com or email us at info@thembs.com. My name's Lee Jones. I am the Head of Manufacturer Solutions at MBS. Typically day to day, I'm involved with a whole ream of different things within the business, particularly marketing, sales, development, production, usually revolving around the manufacturer, but also sometimes the end user as well. But part of my sins, I'm a qualified architectural technologist that prior to joining MBS specialized in sustainable architecture. So it's something I've been looking at with MBS, and I'm going to tell you a little bit more about what we've been doing as a business to become more sustainable. Joining me today as well is Stephen Pryor. Stephen Pryor is from Forest Carbon, and Forest Carbon are MBS's new partner, where we are dealing with carbon credits and forestation in recognition of the carbon emissions that we've been generating as a business. I'll introduce Stephen in a little while when we get to his presentation, but please stick around for it. It's really insightful, and it's quite unexpected how much there is that you need to know when it comes to actually buying carbon credits or offsetting and the different ways that you can go about things. So a great bit of knowledge that's going to be shared from Stephen there. A little bit about MBS. MBS are part of the Big Factor Group, alongside Glenigan in the UK. So MBS and Glenigan are sister companies. We have entities and other businesses of a similar vein under the Big Factor Group throughout Europe. We're also in Australia and Canada as well, and that's constantly expanding. From MBS's point of view, prospectively, everybody on the call will likely be aware of us. We were founded 50 years ago, and we are the National Building Specification. Today, as MBS stands, we are a digital technology company, a platform for the construction industry to connect, write specifications, and conduct projects. So with the specification tool, MBS Chorus, all the specification communities such as architects, contractors, engineers, consultants, etc., will use our tools to actually write their specifications. And alongside that, with MBS Source, we provide a means for manufacturers to communicate their product information, market their products, brand, systems, materials, and a whole host of different things to the specification community. But through the two, the platforms are connected, and we're allowing people to share information and hopefully improve projects moving forward. What I'm going to cover today. So I'm going to start off with the legislation. So what's forcing the need for lower emissions and the reasons behind it. So obviously legislation is required to lower things, but why are we having to lower emissions in the first place? I'm then going to talk about how you can become a low carbon business. And this is going to be based on a case study from MBS. So MBS have recently calculated our carbon emissions for the past 2 years, and are going to be doing that moving forward alongside a reduction plan. So I'll cover everything that we've done there and how we went about it. We'll then talk about accreditation schemes, and we'll focus on the UN Climate Neutral Now scheme. And then I'll introduce you to Forest Carbon, and Stephen Pryor will talk you through everything that you need to know regards to carbon credits and offsetting. And then ultimately, hopefully this webinar would have given you more knowledge, if you didn't already have that, on how to become a more sustainable business yourselves moving forward. So let's talk a little bit about the green movement. So everything from a legislation point of view, really in the UK, has been going on for a while, but I think the main sort of turning point was the 2008 Climate Change Act. So the government set out a declaration to reduce greenhouse gas emissions come 2050 by 80% of what they were in comparison to 1990 levels. This was quite pioneering, and it's gone further to the point where we've now become the first country as of this year to actually state that we are going to aim for 100% reduction in those emissions now, not the 80%. So a big target. It's something that's really needed, but it's also very optimistic, and there's a lot that we need to do if we are physically going to achieve this. Part of this is aiming for net zero. So alongside the reductions in emissions, we need to be looking at offsetting and capturing carbon as well. And to do that, we've got a carbon budget. So the UK's got one. As a business, you could set up your own to make sure that that you're on track with the reduction of emissions. Obviously, as businesses potentially could expand, you could be actually generating more year on year, when the reality is you need to be making less and less, irrespective of the situation. So yeah, there's a lot that we can talk about there, and we'll cover some of that in a moment. There's also a lot going on. So most of this is based on science. So climate change is real. It's something that's been happening really from a human perspective, and a general increase since the start of the Industrial Revolution. The UK, obviously, we're a big part of that instigation, and obviously there's a lot that we need to do to help climate this. The UK, coincidentally, are one of the leaders in sustainability and reducing climate change. However, there's a lot that we can do, and we also need to make sure that we're ensuring everybody else is doing their part and helping them where we can. To the latest guidance, the IPCC report came out this year, and likewise, many of you would have known that and seen things in the news. What we're saying is we're actually potentially past the turning point. So to keep global warming down to a 1.5 degree increase, we think we're actually going to exceed that by the time the 21st century is out. So we need to do more, we need to do it fast, and there's going to be a lot of focus on the COP26 summit in October. So this has been held in Glasgow, and it's the conference of the parties. It's where all the UN leaders will get together, discuss climate change and how each region can go about doing more to actually generate that. So we would expect this time to see more legislation come out the back of it. Legislation is something that's been a little bit limited to date. So unless things are enforced, we know as well, particularly with our industry, that people tend to not to take too much note of things. There's a lot of consciousness, people just wanting to do the right thing, to be ethical at the moment. But for a lot of businesses, unless they absolutely have to, that they might not do that. So keep an eye on that. MBS will be reporting on that after the event. So as part of this webinar series, we've got the next 3 following this one. And then once COP26 is out of the way, we'll actually be doing a full review and discussing how that impacts the construction industry. So CO2 in numbers. Global CO2 emissions in 1990 were 22.7 billion tons. So that's CO2 equivalent. In 2019, it was 36.4. So that's a 60% increase from sort of 20 years ago, just over. It's not 30 years ago, sorry, I do lose track of the time. In 30 years, that is a massive increase. The UK, coincidentally, have actually lowered ours. So what it was in 1990 is 637 million tons. We're only a small island, but we do have a high population. And now it's 468 million tons as of 2019, which is a 27% decrease. So still a long way to go to reach that 100%. But for anybody listening to the webinar today, out of all of that weight, 40% of that's coming from the built environment. So as a sector, we really must play our part to lower this. So the UK is committed to 100% come 1990. In comparison to 1990 levels come 2050, and we need to make sure that we're hitting net zero. Gross zero, which would be complete reduction of all emissions, is completely unattainable. So net zero is the sort of happy medium. So what is net zero? Well, carbon neutrality and net zero are similar things, but there is a slight difference. So if we look at the scales on this image, we could say that we were placing the carbon weight on those scales. So if 2021's weight was higher than 1990s, what's stopping us from just planting trees, investing in peatland, investing in carbon capture technology and offsetting those? Well, it's not good enough. We're still generating those emissions in the first place. And to drastically reduce, we need to completely reduce the emissions and then offset as a last resort. So that's what net zero is aiming for. We're looking to firstly reduce the weight of the CO2 come 2050. So in comparison to 1990 levels. And then will offset, whether that's through plantation, forestation, peatland, it could be carbon capture technology. There's a lot of investment going into that sort of sector at the moment. But to reduce and then remove to equal balance is the main game. Measuring carbon emissions then, how do we go about that? Well, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol is a good start. They've defined emissions under 3 scopes. So scope 1 is direct emissions from owned and controlled sources. So this could be something like your company fleet, so company cars, things that your sales reps might drive around in, or vans, anything that's owned and controlled by you that you actually can limit or have control over what emissions it generates. Scope 2 is indirect emissions from the generation of purchased energy, so electricity, steam, heating and cooling. For most businesses, that's likely going to be gas and electricity. Likewise, for most households, if it's your own personal carbon footprint that you'd be measuring. There will be manufacturers, etc., that will be procuring steam and cooling potentially. But for most businesses, particularly in the office space sector, gas and electricity are going to be the 2 main ones. And then scope 3, and this is where it gets a lot more complex, is any other indirect emissions that occur in the value chain. So this could be things like non-fleet travel, so air flights, your employees commuting to work and back. It could be the use of data centers, MBS in particular, or a cloud technology company. And we rely heavily on data centers to surface the software and the tools for the industry. So that could be something that's you're familiar with as well. Working from home. Not many people did this prior to the pandemic, but it's been a big part of our lives over the past 2 years, and has looked like it's going to be a big part of our lives for the future. Obviously, we're generating emissions at home that weren't being generated when we were sat at a desk in the office or we were stood on site, and that really needs to be calculated, because we're at risk of losing where those emission capture might be there. Then go to things like purchased goods, waste disposal. There's a whole list. This isn't completely concise, but it gives you a flavour of what those indirect emissions are. So scope 3 is typically where most businesses will find it difficult to measure the emissions. Scope 1 and 2, as you can imagine, are relatively simple. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how we've done that. MBS have calculated our scope 1 and 2 and part scope 3 for 2019 and 2020, and we'll be doing the same each year moving forward now as well. So MBS as a case study, how are we aiming to become a low carbon business? Well, the thing that started it all was MBS has obviously invested heavily in our tools and the technology that we provide to customers over the past few years, and we've been developing these things since the 1970s. But MBS Source and MBS Chorus, as they are today, provide a means for specifiers to specify more sustainably on projects, but we're also pushing manufacturers to provide more sustainable and environmental credentials with relation to their product data. So whether that's embodied carbon, where the material manufactures from, and so forth. We're trying to make the industry better through the tools that we provide. But realistically, we need to practice what we preach. There's a load of articles that you can go and read online. If you visit the mbs.com, there's a load there. But customers are asking for this now. It doesn't matter what your supply chain is or who your customer base is. Sustainable decisions are being considered more and more every day, irrespective of the sector. And the construction industry is at the top of that pile. We need to be providing more information. MBS are doing that through the tools, but we also want to be being more sustainable ourselves as a business. So it isn't something that we've just crashed into this year. We've actually made some conscious decisions in the past, notably back in 2016 when we refurbed our office. So at the time, we were looking at procuring a new office, which would have resulted in a higher set of embodied carbon, so in the steel concrete of building something. And likewise, if we were going to buy a plot of land to do that, we'd have had to look outside of the city centre. So if we were on a business park somewhere, employees would likely have then drove in to work in their own vehicles instead of relying on public transport, cycling, walking, and so forth. So we retrofitted an office, which kept the carbon emissions down from that point of view, but also remaining in the city centre has allowed the commute to work for most people that are employed by MBS to actually do that more sustainably as well. The building featured a rooftop garden. As a company, we invest in a lot of schemes like Cycle to Work scheme. We have volunteer days, some of which people have used to plant trees, etc. To help this type of thing, alongside other stuff, sort of helping homeless shelters and that kind of thing. The building was done with some foresight, expecting the EV revolution to come along, and the car park, which is underground, was fitted with EV chargers. There's a load of different things that we can do, and we're very active in supporting the local community, particularly schools and different charities around the industry and around the Northeast as well. So how did we go about calculating our carbon footprint? Well, we decided to do this at the beginning of this year, and we've calculated it for 2019 as a basis. Obviously 2020, because of the pandemic, was always going to be an anomaly, but it gives us a good benchmark to understand what was happening. So aligning to those greenhouse gas emissions from the GHG protocol, we started with scope 1. And our scope 1 emissions was limited to fleet. So it was our company cars and the one company van that we had, which coincidentally was electric. And we measured the carbon emissions from there. Now, this is done in kilograms of CO2 equivalent per kilometre. So to do this, it was a relatively simple task as long as the data is being kept structured either by your employees or the facilities management team. So having a log of the vehicles that you own or are leasing, the CO2 emissions for that vehicle, and then a log of the mileage, business mileage that those vehicles have done throughout the year. Very easily you can calculate then how many tons of CO2 has been generated as a total from each vehicle in comparison to the mileage that each vehicle has done. Moving on to scope 2 emissions, gas and electricity. Again, this was probably the most simple one. Everybody gets the gas and electric bill. You get this as a consumer at home. Businesses get these as well. And it's a case of measuring the carbon against the kilowatt hours used. So for every kilowatt hour of that energy you used, there would have been potentially some carbon emitted. There definitely would have been for gas. Gas can't be provided in a renewable manner. We're burning a fossil fuel and ultimately it generates CO2. So you can take the average of what gas generates from a CO2 perspective once it's burned. And then if you've got that as a kilowatt hour figure, you can then multiply that by how many kilowatt hours you've used throughout the year. Electricity is a little bit more complex depending on the tariff that your business might be on. It could be that you're on a fully renewable energy tariff, in which case your carbon emissions for there might be zero. But if you've got a mixed supply or if you're not on renewable, you need to be checking with the provider what that is, and then working out what the CO2 equivalent is per kilowatt hour through that provider there. But it's easy to do. Scope 3 became a little bit more difficult in some areas. For us, flights and rail was straightforward. We've always worked with a travel partner. So we've got a travel agent that books all our flights and rail travel through the company portal. They, as part of that service, calculate the carbon CO2 equivalent for those kilometres and journeys that we do, and the flights and things are split between long haul, short flights, etc., to ensure that the carbon emissions are accurately adjusted to suit whatever the flight is and so forth. Non-fleet miles was a little bit difficult. So if we're looking at for something like employees commuting to the office and traveling home, we had to do a company survey for this. So what we did, we used Google Forms and we asked the company to respond and let us know typically in a typical week how many days they would have worked in the office, how far away they lived from the office, and what type of transport they would usually use. From that, we would be able to calculate an average based on this per person, and we generated this. Now, for non-fleet miles, data centers and working from home, we've had to declare these figures as an estimate, but it is based on a worst case scenario. So we'll always be slightly under what we're actually claiming that they were for those figures, just to be on the safe side. For data centers, again, a little bit more difficult depending on who your provider is. There's a lot with Amazon Web Servers. Now, Amazon Web Servers will not be provided from renewable sources until 2025, according to their website. So obtaining the data for this is quite complex. If you're doing this, if you want to speak to us and see what we've done, by all means, drop us a note, but it's a little bit too complex to actually talk through on the webinar now. But it involved a lot of website traffic, surfacing of pages, the amount of energy that we consume through calculating it through there, and then working out averages, etc., based on other data center usage, and then coming to a figure that was estimated from that. Working from home, there was actually a paper published by Ecolabs, which was supported by NatWest and Lloyds Bank. If anybody's interested in that, I think I've got the link for it later on in the presentation, but if not, drop us a note and we can share that with you. But it provides calculations based on UK grid emissions for a typical person working from home for a typical set time of day. Obviously, if your business hours are slightly less than the average 8 hours a day for the UK, you can just adjust that accordingly doing there. But again, it gives a good estimated figure, but again, based on a worst case. So for example, if every employee was on a renewable electricity tariff, your emissions would likely be lower than what that calculation would say, but it's giving that worst case scenario to make sure that if you are going to look at buying carbon credits and offsetting later down the line with those, that you're covered and you're not offsetting against a lesser amount than you should be. So the easy to do bits was the scope 1. Scope 2 was relatively easy, and then for us, the flights and rail were relatively easy because the travel agent had done it. If it was that we didn't have the travel agent doing that, again, they would be quite complex, and we'd need a log of the distance, the type of flight, where the flight was going to, how many employees were sat on the flight, and so forth to calculate this. Rail would have been slightly easier, but again, you wouldn't have needed a log of all the destinations and then the mileage from those plus the return journeys as well. The more difficult side of things was the non-fleet miles, and this was the one where we had to do a company survey to understand commuting, etc., into the office. But we managed to calculate that through averages based on the questions that we asked. And then working from home, that's the Eco Act emissions white paper. If anybody wants to take a look at that, I'm sure if you Google that title there, it'll come up. But if not, drop us a note and be happy to send you a link through for that. And then lastly, data centers. This was probably the most difficult one for us to do. We're provided by Amazon Web Servers. If you're using Google, I believe they've been on renewable electricity since 2007. So you might be in a better place there. But yeah, moving forward, everybody's emissions through that use are going to start to be lowered as the energy providers of the data centers have to start becoming renewable. So what was the result? Well, after we'd done all the calculations, we realized that in 2019, as a business, we generated 550 tons almost of CO2. Quite scarily, what this did was it highlighted the hotspots, so the bits that we were generating the most in. Now, 2019 was a slightly unusual year. It wasn't completely normal for MBS. We were actually going through a lot of acquisitions in Australia, and as you can see, the flights as a result are quite high there. There was a lot of toing and froing from the UK to Australia, which is probably one of the longest long-haul flights that you could do, plus the return journey. So the emissions there were quite high, but I think what it's raised is the awareness that how damaging flights can be to the environment. So moving forward, we've set some mitigation in, which I'll touch on in a little moment. But gas and electricity, one thing that we didn't realise, and this might be a surprise to some companies as well, we'd actually changed our energy provider partway through that year, the electricity provision in particular, for a company that was, without us realizing, providing 100% renewable energy. We were then talked into moving contract to somebody else because they offered a better price, better deal, but without realizing they didn't have renewable energy. So we'd actually increased our carbon emissions without realizing in that point. But we've actually dealt with that now, and it's going to be changed moving forward. As a comparison to 2020 then, and obviously the pandemic hit sort of March time, then for the rest of the year, mainly people working from home, people weren't traveling as much. Our emissions were actually 50% less than they were in 2019 for the stuff that we could measure. Now the flights obviously were still relatively high. We had 3 months of that, but in comparison to the year before, it was a lot lower. But what you would have noticed there is things like the electricity is increased, and that was partly down to that provider. So in 2019, we'd had 6 months use of a renewable energy provider, and then the later 6 months were a non-renewable provider. But then for 2019, the entirety was non-renewable. So there was little bits that we very quickly identified and we could act upon and lower the emissions moving forward relatively easily. So On that then, we came up with a plan, and this is continually improving, so it's not set in stone. We've done some quick wins, and then we've got the longer journey to plan for, which we're looking at the moment, but we're doing that with the group. And hopefully make the whole Big Factor group more sustainable as well as just MBS. So from an energy provision point of view, once we'd done these calculations, obviously we were a little bit shocked as to what we discovered. And from June this year, our energy for electricity was switched to 100% renewable provider again. Unfortunately, one of the downsides of having a grade 2 listed building is gas. It still runs on gas in a lot of places for the heating, but we have switched the gas provision to an ISO 14001 accredited supplier that's looking into carbon offsetting themselves. So we're trying to make that joint effort there. Until we can look at removing the need for gas, that is the best we can do. But obviously, the end game is to obliterate the use of the fossil fuels entirely. Let's see what comes out of COP26. The government have published things like the hydrogen strategy and so forth. There may be something that we can do there, or if not, we can look at alternative means through electricity. But that's a big change, require a lot of investment, and it's not something that we could just do overnight. From a travel perspective then, I met with the CEO at the time, and we agreed that a web-first approach to all external meetings needed to be implemented. One, it makes our employees more efficient. It makes the business cheaper to run in some ways because we're not doing the travel. There's less requirement for the cars to be on the road, less requirements for people to fly around, etc., or catch a train. But ultimately it's reducing that carbon. So MBS, if you get approached to have a meeting from us, we will always ask if we can meet through Teams or Zoom unless it's absolutely necessary. And that's the same for internal meetings as well. We'll then look at travel as the last resort. MBS's fleet, so the company vehicles that we have, it's quite a small number. I think we've got around 10 vehicles now in the fleet. It's being reviewed as we speak. So that will be, the outcome of that will be known to the employees in October as to what's happening. Are we looking at changing the amount of vehicles that we've got that run on diesel or petrol, or are we looking at reducing and replacing with something else? That's yet to be seen, but it is being reviewed. Waste management. Our facilities management team are looking at improvements on this. So we've recycled for a number of years now, everything's split in bins. And if anybody's visited the MBS offices, you'll know how pristine it is and that we're very orderly and everything's got its own place, including the recycled content. But one thing we've never done is weighed the amount of waste that we do. So we're going to look at that moving forward as well. And we can then learn to calculate the emissions from our waste disposal and the amount that we recycle and so forth as well. And then lastly, from an initial thing is the supply chain. So our facilities managers had initially contacted, after we'd done this calculation, the supply chain with anybody that we spend more than £10,000 sterling a year with to see what their environmental credentials were. That's now been amended, and it's anybody over 5,000 has actually been approached now, and we're looking at getting the supply chain provision as sustainably sourced as possible. So things like packaging, what we're getting, services as well as goods, making sure that we can do that, and then hopefully we'll be able to get some measurements, science-based measurements from that moving forward as well. Next thing that we did, once we'd worked out what we were doing and decided that we actually now have a clearer picture to make a reduction plan, is we wanted some third-party accreditation. Now, the United Nations, through their Sustainable Development Goals, obviously leading the world in what's going on with regards to sustainability, or ESG generally, so the environmental, social and governance. The UN have got a lot of information on that, from the Paris Accord right through to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. But one scheme that they have for businesses is the Climate Neutral Now scheme. Now, this is for any business to sign up to. You sign the pledge once, but what you have to do is you have to then commit to measuring your carbon emissions on an annual basis. You have to commit to producing a reduction plan over the next few years, and you have to contribute to offsetting carbon capture and then report on that annually. So MBS are now listed on this site. There's no data for us on there at the moment because we have only just joined this year and we need to publish the 2021 results. But moving forward, that'll be published annually, and it'll give the public as well as ourselves visibility as to how we're getting on with reducing our emissions year on year. we've had started to look at forecasting as well based on the knowledge that we've now got. But there's a few little unknowns that we just need to iron out before we can maybe start predicting where we're going to be moving forward. But just as a bit of hindsight, aiming for net zero isn't going to be easy for most businesses, including one such as ourselves that are a technology company. Once we'd done that all, then we started to consider carbon offsetting. Now, carbon offsetting seemed relatively straightforward at first thought. It was like, okay, we need to measure what we've got, work out how many trees offset a ton of carbon, and then just duplicate it by how many tons we made and buy some trees. Doesn't quite work that easy. You have to go through carbon credits, and yeah, there's different ways of doing it, whether you're going for ex-ante credits or post credits. There's a whole host of different things, whether you're looking at buying early forests, local forests, so you're going to get saplings planted that are then offset in 15 years only once the trees have grown, or you're looking at international to offset. Now, aligning to the RIBA plan of work and the UN Sustainable Development Goals about supporting local communities and habitats and so forth, we wanted to plant locally. So what we've done in recognition of our 2019 and 2020 emissions, we've actually formed a partnership with Forest Carbon, who are a northeast-based company, one of the earliest, if not the earliest, carbon offsetting business within the UK. And we've actually planted just over 3,000 trees in the northeast. So we've got about 1,500 in County Durham. It's a forest in Crook, and we've got just over 1,500 in Northumberland at St John's Wood. So it's Doddington North, sorry, St John's Wood is the one in Crook. So yeah, there's a lot of trees there. MBS's team recently did a cycle ride out to get a photographic opportunity with that. Strictly no cars or travel allowed. Everybody met on the bikes, and it was only obviously the local people that could take part in that, but they went out. Great success, got some great photos. And if you haven't seen it, check it out on the MBS's social media channels. Great to see there. Okay, so that's a bit about what MBS have been doing in respect to carbon credits and the forestry plantations that we've been involved with through Forest Carbon. I thought it'd be great to get you to hear a bit more from Forest Carbon themselves. So joining me now is Stephen Pryor, and he's going to talk a little bit about carbon credits and what Forest Carbon do, and hopefully it'll help you on your own journey in this type of things. So Stephen, welcome, and if you'd like to share your screen, we'd love to hear from you. Thank you.
I will do, Lee. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks for the invitation to speak today. So the role of Forest Carbon. We have been developing projects across the UK. We're into our 16th year this year. We started in 2006. We were the first people doing this in the UK, planting forests and restoring peatlands across the country, all shapes and sizes, because peat stores CO2 and trees capture CO2, and those two projects also provide a wide range of other benefits too. We have co-funded those projects with the sale of certified carbon credits to businesses in the UK wanting to do something about their emissions, and those credits are certified through the UK Woodland Carbon Code and the UK Peatland Code. We've also developed, in fact, we were the first people to develop either type of project in the UK. We were the pioneers. We're also working at the moment on soil carbon as a new carbon standard. We've also developed those projects you see there in Ireland. They were the first carbon woodland funded projects in Ireland. We've also got a range of international projects that we work with. So we've been innovating the whole way through our time, really. Just give you some summary numbers. I won't go through all of those, but I think the ones that always interest me the most are number of trees planted. That's 10.5 million trees in the UK in the last 16 years that we have planted together with our partners. And the other one I always find amazing is that we, again, together with our partners, have been responsible for 7% of all UK woodland creation. That was over the period 2014 to 2020. So just shows you what an impact businesses can have on the natural environment in the UK. We've also been responsible for planting about 3 million trees outside the UK. So we've got a wide range of partnerships there too. I thought I'd give you a very sort of brief summary of carbon markets, what they're all about, how they work. So for some of you, this will be really simple stuff that you know already, but for others, perhaps it's the first time you're hearing it. We've got two carbon markets globally. The compliance market I'll start with. This is where participation is mandatory. This will include country-to-country trading under the Kyoto Protocol, also business-to-business trading under the EU Emissions Trading Scheme. That's the largest carbon market in the world. Carbon prices are based on normal supply and demand economics, as the credits have supply end dates, and they have people that need to buy them to submit them for compliance. So you can see how that works. A lot of people who are quoting carbon prices are likely talking about this compliance market, but you can ignore most of that, and then we'll move on to the voluntary market, which is of interest probably for most people here. The voluntary market, as the name implies, participation is voluntary. Nobody is compelled to be involved in this. Carbon buyers, which are usually businesses, not always, are paying somebody else to implement a carbon project on their behalf because in-house emissions reductions have become too expensive or too great, so you need to get somebody somewhere else to reduce some emissions. To date, the pricing in this market has been cost-based, i.e. not sort of subject to the normal supply and demand economics. That is changing very rapidly. It has done in the last 6 months, where demand is now starting to outstrip supply, so prices are rising. Project types will include emissions avoidance, and that would include a renewable energy project, for example, or peatland restoration, where you're preventing carbon loss, and emissions capture projects, and a great example of that is forests, which capture CO2 as they grow. And a quick summary here of why or how people participate. The starting point is that you want to reduce your carbon footprint. As I've said, it's voluntary. There are not yet any rules compelling people to do this. First step, best practice, reduce and avoid carbon emissions as far as you can in-house. Not only is it best practice, but it's also sensible, because most times carbon emissions represent resource consumption. So if you can reduce resource consumption, you can reduce costs in the business. At some point, it's just too expensive or impossible to reduce emissions further. Perhaps the technology is just not there. At which point you could effectively pay somebody else to reduce emissions on your behalf. That's offsetting, carried out by buying carbon credits from a project elsewhere that represents emissions avoided or captured. Carbon footprints quantified in tons of CO2 equivalent. We talk about CO2 equivalent because there are 6 greenhouse gases covered under the regime, and obviously it would be quite tedious to have to report each 6 individually, so they all get converted to a CO2 equivalent. So you might see the TCO2E as a notation for that, and each credit represents 1 ton of CO2E avoided or captured. Credits are dated. This is the date by which the emissions reduction will have been achieved by. That's important because if you think about renewable energy projects, they may be generating emissions offsets very quickly because they're avoiding fossil fuel burning, perhaps, whereas a woodland creation project, a lot of that carbon capture won't occur for decades to come. So the credits have dates on them by which you would expect the emission saving to have been achieved. Offset credits should be quality assured independently, so stakeholders, that's businesses investing in them, can be sure of various things. I'll touch on that in a moment, but quality assurance is critical to all of this. Recognized standards, again, I'll touch on this in a moment, but those are the recognized standards that most businesses would use around the world. Principles of quality assurance. In the UK, we use the Woodland Carbon Code and the Peatland Code. Those are both accredited to UCAS, to ISO 14064-5. There are various key principles in there that would apply to any carbon standard anywhere in the world. Conservatism, meaning that the carbon estimates for the project, carbon savings, must be conservative based on the best available science, project specific. Additionality probably is the most critical one in there, which is to say that we need to be able to demonstrate to you, the carbon credit buyers, the investors, that without your intervention, this project would not have proceeded. This is not a business as usual activity that's going to just go on ahead anyway, regardless of whether or not someone buys the carbon credits. And that's important because obviously you want to know that your investment has made a difference, that this is something that wouldn't be there without you. Permanence monitoring, obviously sort of speak for themselves. These projects need to be permanent emissions capture or permanent emissions avoidance. In the case of UK woodland creation projects, for example, UK law supposes or assumes that woodland creation is a permanent legal land use change. So you can assume that there's always going to be a woodland on that piece of land. Buffering is a top slicing effectively of a project where it creates a sort of a pooled insurance scheme. So all projects within a standard are top sliced, and those credits go off into a pooled scheme to ensure all the projects across the scheme. Obviously, projects need to meet best practice in terms of social, environmental, legal, community involvement, all that sort of thing. That's sort of standard in the UK anyway. The woodland creation has to meet the UK Forest Standard, which has higher degrees of regulation requirements with respect to those sorts of things. And again, I touch on there the names and logos of the world's leading sort of voluntary carbon standards. The second element in all this is registries, which is that once a project is certified and the carbon credits are certified, they are issued on a public registry, which is online, so that people can see the status of individual projects. They can see who owns the carbon credits, where they came from, and what businesses are doing with those carbon credits. So if you use them for offsets, for example, you have to cancel them. You can't use a credit twice. So that provides transparency to outside stakeholders that a business is following through on its public statements. In the UK context, we use the UK Land Carbon Registry, which is run by IHS Markit on behalf of the Forestry Commission, the UK government, and the IUCN, who own the standards. Claims you can make, again, this is sort of high level stuff, but it's sort of give you a rough idea. Carbon neutrality, you need to have a sort of high degree of confidence that you actually know what your footprint is. And to be carbon neutral in a given year, for example, 2021, you need to have carbon credits which have delivery dates, I touched on that earlier, which are in the current year or in the past. You can't have carbon credits which are sort of far into the future and use them for offsets in this year. And then you need to retire those credits. I touched on that again a moment ago as well. Those credits need to be publicly cancelled so that people can see that they're not being used twice. Net zero is slightly different definition there. Net zero is around effectively understanding that there's a finite remaining carbon budget that the world can emit, and therefore once you have decarbonized the business, which you have to aim for as your primary objective, then you need to do the best you can to recapture those emissions, and that lends itself towards carbon capture projects as opposed to emissions avoidance projects. And then finally, those final terms, mitigation, balancing, recognition, these are sort of softer statements, means people really need to be clear as to what they are doing and what they're not doing. This enables action instead of inaction. And what I mean by that is a lot of businesses we work with, for instance, small businesses just don't have the resource to kind of come up with the perfect carbon emissions reduction plan or calculate their carbon footprint to the sort of third decimal place, but they really want to do something rather than nothing. So we can help them with that in terms of investing in woodland creation projects. That's a softer statement on their part. They're not claiming carbon neutrality, they're not claiming net zero, but they are recognizing that they want to do something about the environment and do something that is quality assured, transparent, and traced. Excuse me. This is sort of a summation of some of the stuff I've been touching on all the way through. There are effectively two phases in a carbon credit's life, ex ante and ex post. An ex ante credit is really one that's issued in advance of the carbon saving. So at the outset of a project, when it's certified and the projected carbon savings are known, in that case, for example, in the UK, we plant a woodland, we know what the species mix is, we know what the soil type, altitude, latitude, we know what the management plan is, we can predict what the carbon capture at that woodland will be over its lifetime. And that enables the issue of these ex ante credits in advance of that carbon capture. And what that enables in turn is the businesses can invest in these projects at year naught. They can take a stake in the future of the project, and that enables landowners to recover some of the kind of capital costs from the beginning of the project's life. Because obviously, in the case of woodland creation, or in fact, most of these types of projects, they're capital heavy at the beginning. And if you haven't got carbon credits to sell for decades to come, they don't make much business sense. So these ex ante credits are issued at the beginning of a project's life. They then convert sequentially into these ex-post credits, which are the ones that happen after the carbon saving has been achieved. And that's when we go and visit the projects over its lifetime, verify that everything is on track, that you are getting what you expected to get there. And once the project is verified, at each stage, some of those ex-ante credits are converted into ex-post credits. And at that point, they become usable for the harder statements I touched on earlier, of offsetting carbon neutrality, net zero, and so on. And then the different types of carbon credits, so I think I've covered that already: emissions avoidance or emissions capture. This is a bit of a convoluted slide. I won't spend too much time on this one, but the key message in here is that because the carbon market in the UK is pretty new, it's only been going for 15 years, and woodlands particularly don't deliver carbon savings, most of it occurring between years 25 and 45 in a woodland's life. That means even the woodlands that we planted 15 years ago when we started, still not delivering substantial carbon credits at the kind of offset stage yet. So any businesses that we're talking to today who are wanting to offset their carbon with UK projects, UK woodlands, the answer is that it's just not possible. It has to be a strategic investment in these projects, UK woodlands and peatlands as well, a strategic investment in projects that will deliver carbon offsets to the business over decades. So that tends to lend itself to those kind of larger businesses that can make that upfront investment, knowing that it's not going to be recovered for a long time. So that's really the message there. What we're talking to businesses about at the moment is that if they do make that strategic investment, alongside that, they might want to buy some international credits for the short-term offset needs, and then bank the UK credits for the long-term offset needs. That's one option. The other option is to take a sort of a long-term cyclical approach, and instead of wanting to be exactly carbon neutral in a specific year, is to say, over this decade or over these 2 decades or over this 30-year period, we will be carbon neutral over 30 years. We'll invest in some peatland restoration and some woodland creation today that will enable us to be net zero or carbon neutral over that period. But in the first 10 or 15 years of that period, we'll be carbon positive because the project hasn't started working hard yet. But in the second half of that period, we'll be more than compensated as the project overtakes the annual emissions of the business. So that's the sort of second approach, a long-term cyclical approach people are considering. I thought I'd just show you some of our partners, random selection, but some of those you'll recognize from your sector. Probably Foster and Partners and Kia are the two longest standing we've been working with there. Foster and Partners, I think we've created something like 6 or 7 UK woodlands with them. PRP is a recent partner. They have supported a couple of woodland creation projects that they've taken that cyclical approach. They've invested in projects that will effectively make them carbon neutral over a 50-year period, I think it is. So they've taken that long-term approach. And that's it from me.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Really, really insightful, and it's always great to sit and listen to that. It sort of ticks the imagination in a lot of ways, and I think what you've just conveyed there is there's a number of ways that people can go about doing this. So yeah, if anybody wants to know more, feel free to drop Stephen and the team a note. Do you want to just repeat your email address, Stephen, for anybody that's listening?
Yeah, shall I put it on the screen or?
Yeah, or just read it out, whatever you want to do.
It is SDP, Sierra Delta Papa, at forestcarbon.co.uk. Great.
Thanks very much, Stephen, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Cheers.
Cheers. So, yeah, to end, let everybody get on with the rest of their days. To wrap up, some of the key takeaways from the presentation today. The big one, construction sector is responsible for 40% of all global emissions. So we need to be acting as an industry to help this situation. UK is targeting net zero by 2050. It's not going to be easy. It's very ambitious, but there is the potential that we could do this, providing that legislation matches the requirements, but ultimately all of the businesses that are involved in this and people as well in their home lives are helping to do their part. Net zero itself isn't just about offsetting your emissions, you've got to lower those to begin with, and then offset as a last resort. So just make sure that you have got that carbon reduction plan in place, and you're not just investing in carbon capture for the emissions as they are today. Legislation is changing. Let's see what COP26 comes out with. As I mentioned earlier, MBS, as part of this sustainability series, will be reviewing COP26 and giving you some of the key takeaways and findings that are appropriate to the built environment from that. Obviously, COP26 will cover all walks of life from a sustainability point of view, but hopefully you'll tune in and join us then. Ultimately, businesses need to lower their emissions. It'll be surprising when you start to calculate things where there are some really high spots that you might not have realized. Hopefully the MBS case study will help to highlight some of those, and it'll help you on your way. So that's measuring your scope 1, your 2, and as many of your scope 3 emissions as you possibly can. Identify those hotspots, plan for reductions, and then offset. And then lastly, let the industry know what you're doing. There's a lot of good work that's going on that people are doing. The stuff that we've done at MBS, there's a lot of other businesses that are doing things as well. Some of the ones that Stephen was talking about that they partner with as well, from Forest Carbon. It's a great marketing opportunity, and it's something that you could actually lever on. So what is becoming an initial cost and additional work to your business could actually be turned on its head and used to your benefit to actually drive sales and improve your business. So yeah, don't get bogged down by or distracted too much by the amount of work that's got to be done. There's a hell of a load of positives to your business, as well as obviously the main positive impacts to the environment. If anyone wants to know more, if you want to know about the MBS specification tools, if you're a specifier, visit the mbs.com/mbs-chorus. If you're a manufacturer, again, you can go through the mbs.com standard page, but we do land you then on manufacturers.thembs.com. There's a dedicated page there that will talk you through source and how everything that we do in there can help you. If you generally want to read more about the MBS sustainability and what we've been doing from an operational point of view, if you go to the mbs.com and about us on the top page, you can click on sustainability there. We've got our annual sustainability report and a load of other information about what we've been doing. So yeah, on that note, the next session that we have is with my colleague Paul Swaddle, and he's going to be talking about sustainable specifications and specifying sustainable outcomes on projects. So hopefully you'll tune in for the next webinar with my colleague Paul, and until then, we'll see you soon. Thank you very much.